Hello, this is Krystal and thank you for joining me for this week's First Chapter Friday. Today I will be reading from Tim Whitney's Thanksgiving at the Inn. Hope you enjoy. Chapter 1. Where there's a will, there's a way. Are you coming down for breakfast or sleeping away the whole day? Dad barked from the bottom of the stairs. The echo of his hard voice ricocheted off the condo walls like a basketball in an empty school gymnasium, and with such force it should have cracked the plaster. Rolling over in his stiff bed, Heath groaned. Yeah, Dad, that's my plan, he thought. Sleep away the whole day. Good morning to you, too. Heath was almost surprised to see 6 o'clock on the watch on his night table. He shouldn't have been. Dad woke him daily at 6 a.m. It didn't matter if it was a holiday, a weekend, or even summer break. And apparently, it also didn't matter if your grandfather had just died. Yesterday had been, by any measure, a long and upsetting day. Although Heath had dozed during most of the 4-hour trek from New Jersey to Dad's boyhood home in Massachusetts, missing out on most of the beautiful October day and the fiery orange trees along the highway, it was still exhausting, traveling a long way for an inheritance that didn't come, at least not the way either Heath or Dad had expected. Dreams of a new family lifestyle had played in Heath's mind for days. Maybe now Dad would buy him the iPod he'd been wanting for so long. Maybe they could finally get rid of Dad's beat-up Volvo wagon and get something better. Maybe a BMW, like Mike's dad had, or something with a Hemi. Heath shivered as a small wave of guilt washed over him. Someone had died, his grandfather, who even had his same name. Heath didn't really know him, so it was hard to miss him. But something seemed wrong about counting on his fortune, seeing the death of his grandfather, the man everyone called Senior, as an opportunity and not a tragedy. Now, today, Heath knew from the tone of Dad's wake-up call that he'd be on his case all week. Dad had taken the week off from his job to attend the funeral, but it was a few days away, and Heath had no idea if Dad was planning a pre-funeral trip. If not, that would mean 4 days of chores, 4 days of listening to his father's relentless nagging and complaining. Maybe as a matter of course, or maybe as punishment for Heath's recent suspension from school. And that, in turn, meant Heath had to be silent, the best response to Dad's baiting. As Heath reluctantly headed downstairs, though, he had to admit he understood Dad's frustration. The day before, Heath had struggled to remain still as the warped wooden slat of a very uncomfortable chair periodically jabbed his lower back, keeping him from drifting off in the attorney's tired-looking conference room. The only 3 days had passed since his grandfather had fallen from his roof and died. Heath hadn't seen Senior for 7 or 8 years, and it was strange to think those 7 or 8 years would now become forever. It was yet another part of their lousy life to blame his father for. When Senior didn't give his son a dime after selling the factory, Dad had stayed away for good. It was a struggle for Heath even to remember what Senior had looked like. The last crisp memory he had was of the final Christmas day they'd enjoyed as a family at his big Whately, Massachusetts farmhouse. And now the only thing left was the will, read by a short, bald lawyer named Lloyd Pierce. Good afternoon, gentlemen, Lloyd had said in a voice that sounded like he began each day gargling with gravel. Lloyd was the friend of his grandfather who'd called them from the hospital to let them know of Senior's death. When Dad had stood to shake Lloyd's hand, The top of the lawyer's bald head had barely reached Dad's shoulder. Though Heath's dad sometimes spoke about the importance of hiring a short lawyer, Heath could never remember the connection between skill and size. Lloyd's height made him wonder if it was coincidence or if his grandfather had also been privy to this supposed tidbit of practical wisdom. Lloyd shook Heath's hand with a firm squeeze and said, "Shall we get right to the reading?" "Yes, please, Lloyd," Dad replied. Heath watched the dust kick up as Dad plopped back down in his chair. He had very little patience these days. Reading Senior's own words, Lloyd cleared his throat and began. "I, Heath Wellington Sr., read Lloyd, being of sound mind, well, as sound as one may expect at my age, have spent the last several years reflecting and contemplating the legacy I will leave my son Heath Wellington Jr. I have recently come to the unpleasant realization that I squandered the majority of my life in the pursuit of material wealth. This lapse of judgment is something I deeply regret." That's when Heath had begun to suspect that the terms of the will wouldn't be quite what they'd expected. Heath wished he could press the reset button on the last week, going back to before Senior's death, and before the suspension he didn't even deserve, for cheating on a history test he hadn't really cheated on. Not that Dad would understand. No wonder Dad was on edge. Heath was in a lousy mood himself. Usually this happened when there were weekend chores to get through or late-night homework assignments to finish. But now that he was suspended for the next week, the schoolwork wasn't an excuse. He was just drained. At the bottom of the steps, Heath looked left and right, as if his dad was a monster to be avoided. He tried to savor these last few moments before he was berated, or put to work, or whatever else his dad had planned. He tried to remember the look on Dad's face when Lloyd had read the will. "Just how much pain I have caused has become more evident over the last few years," Senior wrote, "when I tried time and time again, unsuccessfully, to reconcile with Junior. Heath's grandfather had gone by the shorthand of Senior, and his dad had always been Junior, with Heath, and Heath alone, called by the name they all shared. I've written letters asking him to bring my grandson to my house for the holidays," Senior's will continued. "I've sent cards, presents, and even money in hopes that he would visit and find it in his heart to begin to forgive me." Heath had stared at Dad then, wondering why Heath had never received any of the cards and gifts. He could understand why Dad would keep the money, but why would he keep gifts and letters? He pictured a shoebox full of Hallmark cards shoved under the bed or hidden in the back of a closet. It was a shock, for sure, but not as big as the one Dad got a moment later when Lloyd read that Dad would receive his father's estate if, and only if, he took a new direction in life by successfully managing Senior's bed and breakfast with Heath for the next 3 months. "A cook?" Dad had said. "Help me here, Lloyd." "Bed and breakfast?" Lloyd nodded. "That," he replied, "would be your family homestead on Cheshire Lane. I believe it's been in the family since 1862, and, if I am not mistaken, it's where you grew up. Senior began renovating it 3 years ago, with a man named Winston. They turned the old place into a modest bed and breakfast. It's been catering to mostly unfortunate souls ever since. At present, there are 3 tenants, plus Winston, living there. Oh, just what I need, a house full of strays." Dad's chair screeched on the wooden floor as he pushed it back and began pacing the office. With each turn, the scowl on his face became more severe, the furrows of his brow deeper. Lloyd then asked Dad if he wanted something to drink, which was a loaded question. But Dad, fortunately, asked only for water. So did Heath. Shortly thereafter, cracking the cap on his water bottle and swallowing noisily, Dad had said, "All right, what other nonsense did the old bastard line up for me?" The other nonsense, Heath remembered, was a laundry list of stipulations. Dad couldn't sell the place. If he did, the entire inheritance would go into a trust. He couldn't be rude, inconsiderate, or nasty to the current tenants. Indeed, if the 4 and only 4 tenants were unsatisfied, the inheritance again would be lost. Dad had started pacing Lynn. "Lloyd, you've got to be kidding," he said, running his fingers through his blonde hair, tugging at it in frustration. "Is this some kind of sick joke my father is playing on me from beyond the grave? One final slap in the face? I assure you, this is your father's will, just as he intended. I was by his side when he drafted it." He paused. "While I'll admit it is a tad unorthodox, this is truly his final legacy. During the last few months, he spoke more and more of his desire to reconcile with you." Without thinking, Heath blurted out, "What was Senior like?" Dad glared, but Lloyd smiled. "He was tough as aged hardwood," said Lloyd, "and driven by a single purpose, to retire a rich man. His own father had died a pauper. While he had just a 3rd grade education, your grandfather reached his goal. He became a savvy businessman and a millionaire many times." "Can you skip the history lesson?" Dad said. "We have to get back on the road in order to make Jersey by this evening." Heath had sunk into his seat then. It was like Dad was keeping Senior from him in death as much as in life. "And you called him an old bastard?" he thought. "Look who's talking. You kept gifts and cards from your own son." Lloyd ran through the rest of the will quickly. The weekly $250 stipend to provide breakfast, pay expenses, and supply Heath a suitable allowance. The $200 weekly rent paid by all 4 tenants combined. And the requirement that all chores and everyday tasks be completed by Junior and Heath, and no one else. And finally, Lloyd had withdrawn a lime green envelope from a pile of papers, tapped it twice, and slid it across the table to Dad. He also wrote you an apology. Dad had snatched up the letter, grimacing at something written on the envelope, and placed it into a side jacket pocket, shaking his head. Within minutes of departing the attorney's office, Dad had decided to return to New Jersey, determined never to set foot in that inn. Forever a creature of habit, he'd chosen to drive late into the night rather than sleep at the nearby Watley Hotel. They left town, pulling off the highway briefly to grab dinner at a Cracker Barrel restaurant. He'd had a hard time enjoying the first real food he'd had in months. His father kept pushing him to finish. Back on the road, Heath crashed hard into a dreamless sleep. But now, first awake and in the kitchen, Heath spotted Dad arranging several travel-weary banana boxes lining the kitchen counter like used books on a shelf. Heath yawned as he pulled the milk from the fridge and sniffed it to be sure it hadn't soured. "Putting some stuff in storage?" Heath asked. "Not quite," said Dad. And what came next, Heath would never have expected, not after his dad had so clearly and so angrily made up his mind. "Get your things," said Dad. "We're moving out." And that is the end of Chapter 1 of Tim Whitney's Thanksgiving at the End. If you would like to know what happens next, check out this title on Hoopla. Thank you and have a good day.